Thanks so much for being here. It's great to be together. Everybody who's joining us, wherever you live, thanks for being here as well. We are jumping into 1 Timothy chapter 5. We are coming to the end of the book of 1 Timothy. So several weeks ago, we started this journey where we looked at one letter. It is written about 64 AD by the Apostle Paul to his protege, Timothy. They've spent at least a decade together. And Timothy has learned, he's watched, he's helped. And a few years before this letter is written, Paul leaves Timothy in the city of Ephesus, which is a city of over 500,000 people. It's probably the third largest city in the Roman Empire. And it has this new fledgling church. It's these followers of Jesus, and it's the midst of a culture that has different values, and Timothy is struggling. He is a little despondent. He wants to quit. We're going to read even this weekend that he's unhealthy. He has some health concerns. And Paul writes this very intimate letter. This is different than many of the books in the Bible where they're meant for a people group. This is a letter to Timothy, reminding him of who he is, helping to cement his understanding of grace, trying to keep him on track. And we've been learning from this letter as we move along. So here's what is in chapter 5. We're going to do the whole chapter. And for anybody who would say, I really like practical things, this is an intensely practical chapter, okay? So it's not terribly like way out there theological, but it's it gives us direction on what happens Monday through Friday in a church. So I don't know, 2 or 3 times a year, I'll meet somebody who's typically not familiar with church, and they'll ask me, they're like, do you have a job during the week? Because they just think I've got the best schedule in the world. I work Saturday night, and I work till like 1 o'clock on Sunday, and then the rest of the week is, And I said, oh, yeah, I do, but it's because I get it. They're wondering, this is what you do. You guys come together and spend a little time, sing some songs, pray, study the Bible, and then nothing until the next weekend. No. The church has a job to do during the week. We really do. How we do that, maybe we don't do that well. Maybe that's why people don't know about it. So it gives me an opportunity to talk about what happens during the week. And that's what Paul's talking about in this text. What happens during the week? What should a church be doing? So here's what we're going to cover. Number 1, Paul's going to talk about relationships. How do we get along? Number 2, Paul's going to talk about care for the poor. And in this situation, in the city of Ephesus, there is a significant group that is really struggling, and it's widows. So many women, husbands have been conscripted to fight for Rome, and their husbands die on the battlefield. And we'll talk about all the tension that creates. So you've got these groups of women, many of them young, whose husbands have been killed, and there's no social net to care for them. And then at the end, Paul's going to talk about leaders. And this one is a little bit challenging for me because he's going to talk about leaders having to be accountable to everyone, and what happens when a leader fails, and what happens when there's accusations against a leader. Okay, you ready? Let's jump into this. First, we're going to talk about human relationships. So Paul's going to do something extraordinarily simple, but deeply profound. We have always had problems in relationships at a micro level. Friendships, marriages, family issues, neighbors. We're still trying to figure this out. At a macro level, racism, classism, gender tensions. We've got a war on the other side of the planet right now. It just goes on and on. And when this was written 2,000 years ago, they didn't know how to get along very well. And guess what? I don't think we've made a ton of progress over the last 2,000 years. And so Paul's going to give Timothy this very simple way of thinking that will help him deal with relationships and actually change the dynamic within the church. Okay, so within the church, it's going to be different. Let's read this together. It's the model of a family. Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort, which means to build up. Exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, and older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters, with absolute purity. This one at the end is important. We know that Timothy is a young man and he doesn't appear to be married. And Paul's even saying, hey, like those ladies in the church, you're like an eligible bachelor. You got to treat them as sisters and have like really thoughtful. I need you to be conscientious about your own purity in this. So here's what Ephesus looks like. It's a multicultural city. It's one of the largest harbors in what we call Turkey today. And so you have people there from as far away as India and North Africa and what we know today as Great Britain. And they've all come there. It's this hub of trade. And it's multicultural. And here's part of the challenges in Ephesus. One, only about 1/3 or 1/4 of all the Roman Empire were called citizens. If you were a citizen of the Roman Empire, you had privilege. You were guaranteed, if you were accused of a crime, that you could go before a jury or a judge. 2/3 to 3/4 of the Roman Empire were not citizens, and if somebody accused you of something, you didn't even have the right to defend yourself. You had very few property rights. And citizenship was not something that was easily achieved. And so you've got this class distinction between Roman citizens and everybody else who occupies the Roman Empire. Another challenge in the Roman Empire, slavery. 1/3 to some would say even 1/2 of the entire Roman population are slaves. Now, we need to think a little bit different. It's not like the history of slavery in North America or the West. Slavery in the first century was more like indentured servitude. It's how you paid back things that you didn't have the cash. So there was no such thing as bankruptcy. So if you had borrowed money to start a business and your business failed, legally, the people that you owed money to could come into your house, they could take you and take your children and take your spouse and put you in indentured servitude where you worked as a slave until that debt was completely paid at like something very similar to minimum wage. And so you have a massive portion. And if you couldn't pay it off in your lifetime, then your children and your grandchildren were responsible to be slaves to pay off whatever it was. So you have this tension, and then in Ephesus you have Jewish people and non-Jewish people, and you've got gender and cultural and ethnic things. And here's what Paul says. Okay, what if we took this model of family and we said, here's how we're going to relate to each other. People that think differently than me, have different opinions, have different theological stances, but because we're all part of the same family, I'm going to look at men who are older than me and I'm going to treat them like my father. And I'm going to look at women who are older than me and I'm going to treat them like a mother. And I'm going to look at my contemporaries and I'm going to look at people who are younger than me and I'm going to treat them like a brother and like a sister. So Jesus was huge on this. Okay? In one discussion with his disciples, he makes a statement. He says, this is how all mankind will know that you are my disciples, by the way that you love one another. So Jesus says the hallmark, the thing that should stand out within the church is this, is that when we disagree with people, when we have different goals, we don't find friction, we don't find hatred. Instead, we choose to love, we choose to have respect for one another, we choose to move forward. We do not let things fall apart because of agendas, because somebody has a different ethnicity than we do. Paul says, let's get rid of all that. Let's deal with everything from gender issues to racism to not being able to get along with our neighbors, just treat people like they're family. Now, where this falls apart is if your biggest challenges in your relationships are with your family, right? So if you treat your father terribly, Paul's not saying, hey, treat all the other older men like you do your dad, yell at him and call him names. No. But here's what's interesting. Notice this about 31 years ago when Jen and I got married. You naturally have grace and patience for your family of origin. And Jenny, my wife, has all this patience for her family of origin, and I don't. I'm like, man, your family's weird, right? And then it's reciprocated. She's like, no, your family's weird. I'm like, no, they're not. No, we're completely normal. I'm like, no, that's just the way my uncle is. Like, don't let it bug you. He didn't mean it. He's just crazy. And we all know that. We're fine with it. But, right? So there's this thing that Paul's saying, like, hopefully in your family, there's respect and there's grace. And you look at the weirdos in how many people have weirdos in their family? And you're like, that's Uncle Eddie, right? We love him. We always have. We always will. Paul says, let's do that. Like in this church in Ephesus where you've got all the tension that we've been reading about, theological tension, gender tension. He says, let's treat each other like family. Let's live differently. This is just one of the themes of the heart of Jesus. And it's this idea of he's creating a new family. You know who's got this down? There's two people groups that I think really have this down. My friends from Hawaii and then all my friends who are native. Like if you're native, you get this. I remember the first time I went with a friend and I was on the reservation and we kept meeting, like I met like 40 people who were his aunt. I'm like, there's no way you don't have that many aunts. I've got like 2 and they've never talked to me in my life. Here's what happens, like in Hawaiian culture and native culture, you look at someone who's older than you, 1 generation older, and they're an uncle or an aunt. 2 generations older, they're a grandma or a grandpa. And it's within that culture, there's a sense of we are family and we're together. And this is not easy for us who are Western and very individualistic. We think of immediate family, and Paul says, open up your thinking. When you're at work and there's tension with your boss, and she's a lady, she's older than you, talk to her like you would your mom. Be respectful. So I have an ongoing difficult relationship with an older woman. It's been going for more than a decade. And I have tried, and I don't have a lot of these like tense relationships. I can usually find a way to win people, but his gone on, and I'm like, I can't win with this. And as I was reviewing this, I thought, okay, I'm gonna treat her like my mom. Now, I don't know, a lot of you know my mom because she lives here in town. My mom and dad are terrific people, but my mom is like basically angelic. All right, she's just one of the sweetest, kindest people. And I thought about it, I go, okay, what if I treated this other lady like I treated my mom? Like, I don't wanna do that. My mom is deserving of respect. This other lady's just been mean to me. I don't wanna like treat her like my mom. But that's what Paul's asking us to do. Let's think differently, okay? Human relationships. Now, here's the second thing that he moves into. How do we help people in need? So this book, we talk a lot about what this book emphasizes. One thing that this book emphasizes that we don't talk about enough is care for the poor. There are over 2,000 references in the Old and New Testament dealing with the poor and how we care for the poor and how we do that well. So here's what is happening in Ephesus. There is a crisis in terms of single women who are widows. If you are not a citizen of the Roman Empire and your husband died, there was no social network to help you. So there are women who were considered, if you weren't a citizen, you were considered a piece of property of your husband. And so you have women, young women we're going to read about, older women who do not have husbands. And in that culture, it was a crisis. You were incredibly vulnerable. Very vulnerable. And so what's happening is like all these widows are coming to the church, and the church feels like, hey, somebody's got to do something about this. We need to do something about this. And so they create this system, but it's overwhelming the church. And so here's what Paul's going to write. He's going to write, hey, you need to come up with a list, and you need to figure out how to help and who to help, because there will always be a need. So as we read this, here's what I'd love for you to think, because you look at poverty, you look at joblessness, you look at global issues, and it seems overwhelming. And here's what Paul's going to do. He's going to say, hey, yeah, I want you to help, but I want you to help in a really thoughtful way, and I want you to help in a responsible way. What we're looking for is responsible charity. All right? So this is what Paul says. I do have to warn you, Paul is not a romantic. You will never find his quote on a Valentine card. He's just gonna be really blunt and abrupt in several things, so just hang in there. But he's just trying to help Timothy figure out who's the church responsible to help. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. So from the very beginning, Paul's saying this. Not everybody who says they are in need is actually in need. You have to decipher. So not everybody who's standing on a street corner holding a sign is really in need. But how do you find out? Because does anybody have like internal dialogue when you stop at the light and there's somebody holding a sign and you're like, I don't know, do I believe that? Or every now and then it's super refreshing where somebody's holding a sign that says need money for beer. You're like, oh, thanks for your honesty. I don't have to wonder, right? Thank you so much. So he's saying, how do we know who's really in need? But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. Okay, so all the parents and grandparents out there, you love that verse, I changed your diapers. Now it's time to pay me back, right? I fed you. Okay, so Paul says a lot of this is about responsibility. He says if there is a widow and she has kids or grandkids, whose responsibility is it? So our culture, we have to add something different. Is it the government's responsibility? Or is it my responsibility? Paul says, I want you to put your religion into practice. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God. So she has no family and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. So there are some people that speculate that there were widows in Ephesus who were joining the church just because they heard that the Christians took care of widows. And so suddenly you have this hey, we're not even sure that you believe what we believe, but you're showing up at church every week and saying, me too. And so Paul's trying to help him through that. Give the people these instructions so that no one may be open to blame. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Okay, we gotta leave that up for a moment. So we live in a different culture, I get that, a different economy, and we have social systems. And yet, I think we need to read this. Paul is saying this. You need to be responsible for the people in your life, your family members. And how do we think through that? And even I don't even know if the way we do it is very honoring, where we can create retirement homes, which can be great, but it's easy to forget about people there. And I don't know about you, but I've walked through some retirement homes where it feels lonely. Really lonely. So Paul says, he's looking at you, he's looking at me. He's saying, if you have people in your life, step up, be responsible. We'll go on. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60. All right? So he actually puts an age limit on this. You need to be thoughtful, responsible. Has been faithful to her husband and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. As for younger widows, so there's older women, they're over 60, put them on the list, and it almost sounds something like what a nun would do. They devote themselves then to caring for, serving behind the scenes, helping the church. But how about the younger widows? As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list, for when their sensual desires. Paul's never been a huge fan of marriage, by the way. Different places, he's like, I wish you were all single like me, because I'm not distracted by human relationships and Valentine's Day. Doesn't even matter to me, okay? For when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. So a younger woman could say, you know what? I'm going to embrace this. and I'm going to dedicate myself to the service and the prayer and all of this. And then this handsome guy walks into church, and she's like, well, maybe I don't want to be single the rest of my life. Paul says, don't put them in that position where like they could just really struggle. Like, let them get married if they want to, so don't put them on the list. Thus, they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge, a pledge to serve the Lord. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to, okay? So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have, in fact, already turned away to follow Satan if a woman who is a believer has widows in her care. So here's another level of responsibility. There are widows who somehow have capacity and ability, and they have businesses. And if you're a widow and you're caring for other widows, she should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this. Number one, Paul's talking about responsibility. He's saying this: people have a responsibility to care for others, right? We have 2,000 different references to care for the poor. He's also saying that human beings have responsibility. He says if there's a younger woman and she's in need, she has a responsibility to figure this out. If you have a relative who's in need, you have a responsibility to figure this out. There's responsible charity. Here's what we want to avoid. In this instance, it just seems like anybody in need is coming, and Timothy and the church in Ephesus are like, I don't know, I guess we help everybody, and they're being overwhelmed. Irresponsible charity creates two things. It creates dependency, and it steals human dignity. And we don't want to do either one of those. You don't want to steal somebody's dignity. So how do we live this out? I'd say a couple things. One, create a list. Paul told Timothy to have a list. It was like over 60. She's got a reputation. You have to create a list because have you noticed the needs are bigger than the resources? Locally, globally, the needs are bigger than the resources. And so what's that list look like? Well, I think the list is, you just got to be clear. So here's like at a church level, every day of the week, except for Mondays, we're closed on Mondays, there are multiple people who call in and need help in our community. All of our team takes a rotation to answer the calls for people that come in. We have financial applications that far exceed our resources. So who do we help? And when is helping enablement? Is it a crisis or is it a perpetual crisis? Okay? Have you noticed that sometimes you can live in perpetual crisis? You never have money for utilities and you never have money for rent. And that's been happening for 25 years. So what do? Here's a couple thoughts when we make a list. If we prioritize today, the economy's different, our government's different. Here's who I think are the most vulnerable people. It's single moms and sometimes single dads who are raising kids. Like if we get a call and you're a 25-year-old able man and you want help with your utilities, we made a list like Paul did. We'll say, no, but we can help you find a job. But if you are a 28-year-old mom and you're raising 3 kids and a man abandoned you and you're working your tail off and it is barely possible to keep food in your refrigerator and pay your rent and pay your utilities, even you working full time, we're gonna help you. Amen. Because that's not enablement. That's a genuine crisis. And so constantly just thinking through at a global level, what is truly helpful? And then we always want to think holistically, okay? So yeah, we could help you pay your utility bill, but you're too far in debt. You need some sort of training or certification so that you can get a better job. And so part of our help is we're calling City College over there and saying, hey, what if we could help scholarship this person? Because they've got 5 more years, 10 more years of raising these kids, and there is a total cap on their income. But if we could help you get a degree or get a certification, then you could take care of yourself. So be really, really holistic. And I know this is tough, and sometimes it just tears your heart out. In the end, there's 2 ways that the church helps. I want to describe these to you. And both of them are beautiful, but the first is really beautiful. So how does the church help? Number 1, it is when you and I notice a need and step in to fill it, okay? It has nothing to do with this church. It has nothing to do with call the office. It is when God divinely puts somebody in front of you and you realize their need and you just have this sense of this person needs my help. And oftentimes anonymously, you just step in. And rather than saying, why doesn't the government do something about this? Why doesn't some social organization do something about this? You take Paul's words and you go, I'm gonna do something about this. Okay, a couple months ago, we got a call. This gal calls, she's a single mom, 3 kids. She calls and she says, hey, I need help, I need to thank somebody. We're like, for what? She's driving an older minivan. Somebody sees her car during a service and noticed that she has 4 bald tires. And this is what you did, one of you, I don't know who it is. You just took a piece of paper and you wrote, go to such and such tire store and I will have called ahead and they're gonna put 4 new tires on your car. Jesus loves you. And then you slipped it underneath her windshield wiper. And she went and she got 4 new tires on her car and she calls us. She's like, who is it that helped me? I'm like, I have no idea, but man, do I love that. That is just the best. When we develop relationship and caring, and it's not enablement, it's like you have a need and I've got capacity, I wanna step in. There are people in this church that I respect so much, you actually budget for spontaneous giving to the poor. You just make sure that there's a little bit extra so you can help in any way possible. So this is the finest type of giving. It's not institutional and it's not organizational. It's us just saying, hey, 2,000 times the Bible says take care of the poor. I'm gonna develop some criteria and I'm gonna start helping. I'm gonna move towards a need. I'm not gonna ask whose responsibility is this. I'm gonna say this is my responsibility. And then here's the other way, is the church formally helps. Right, we have systems and institutions and we have applications because we want to help in the best way possible. So both of those operate. So think carefully as you consider benevolence. Paul wants Timothy, think through this, buddy, because not everybody who says they have a need is really a need. Sometimes it's enablement. Sometimes you're stealing somebody's dignity. I want you to do this really thoughtfully, but you are responsible. Find out who you're responsible for and then do a good job of taking care of them. All right. Now here's the last portion of scripture. This has to do with leadership, okay? And so the big question is this. So in this new church thing, what does leadership look like? Like our leaders, are they gonna be like Roman emperors who are untouchable? You know, should they be like fantastically wealthy? What happens when one of them fails? Are they protected from criticism? I love that Paul just kind of lays out a really simple plan. We'll read the remainder of the chapter and then we'll talk about leadership. The elders, so the word pastor is only found once in the Bible. That's the word we use most often in English, but elders would be similar. The elders who direct the affairs of the church well, I want you to notice this. There is assessment, okay? Some don't do it well. And you should figure out, is this person leading well, are worthy of double honor. So this is oftentimes pastor's favorite verse. Right? So double honor, by the way, does not mean double income, okay? Which I've seen that on TV preached. It means respect, okay? But only if you do it well. Not just because you are a pastor, it's not a title that insulates you. But if you do this well, you're worthy of honor, especially those who work is preaching and teaching. For scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. The worker deserves his wages. So what in the world is that? This is from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. There was a law that said this: when your oxen, which is, I find it ironic. It's kind of one of the dumbest, slowest-witted animals out there. He compares your elder to an oxen. So here's what would happen. Your oxen would literally work in circles all day, walking in circles, and you would attach a pole to the oxen, and across there would be a huge millstone, too big for people to move. And you would put all your wheat in the bottom of this, and the oxen would step on it, and then as he moved, this stone would, perpendicular to him, would follow him, and it would grind up the wheat into flour. And there's an Old Testament law that says, while your oxen is doing that, walking in circles, grinding your wheat, don't cover up his mouth. Like, give the poor guy a snack, because he's working in circles all day long, helping you. And so you had to keep the mouth uncovered, so the oxen, as he's walking around, be like, delicious, sweet, So that's what Paul says. He goes like, if somebody's doing their job, like, don't muzzle them. Like, let them partake in it. Do not entertain an accusation against an elder unless it is brought by 2 or 3 witnesses. So what do you do when a leader in a church has made a mistake? Well, there are plenty of people who are going to be critical, but Paul says, here's what you want to do. If it's substantiated, if there's a couple of witnesses, you need to follow through on that. You need to really look into that. There's no like immunity because you're some spiritual covering. Like, no, like there needs to be a group of people who take this very seriously. But those elders who are sinning, you are to reprove before everyone so that others may take warning. So, like, we have to deal with dysfunction, okay? Here's what we try to do. If it's you and you made a bad mistake, we try to privately come to you, keep the shame level, exposure level to a minimum, and we try to bring healing. Confront, bring healing. Bad news if you're a pastor, when you're a public minister, you are publicly corrected. Like, you don't hide this stuff. You bring it out into the open. You deal with it with grace and truth. You don't try to cover up. You're frank about it. Okay? I charge you in the sight of God and Christ Jesus and the elected angels to keep these instructions without partiality and do nothing out of favoritism. In leadership, you got to avoid nepotism. You got to avoid any sign of favoritism is just unhealthy. Do not be hasty in laying on of hands and do not share in the sins of other people. Keep yourself pure. Timothy's going to be working with a lot of broken people. He says you need to be conscientious of yourself in the midst of that. Somebody just found their new favorite Bible verse. You didn't even know it was here. Stop drinking only water and use, please notice, a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illness. So Timothy, along with all his anxiety, is dealing with some sort of digestive issue. And Timothy, I don't know why, he probably had foregone drinking water or wine as like a sign of dedication to God. And I love this. Paul writes, he goes, buddy, dude. By the way, water was often really toxic and had lots of illnesses. And part of the fermentation process would actually clean water. That's why the ancient world mainly drank wine. And so the next time you're enjoying a little glass of wine, you just go, Paul, I don't want to do this, but it's for my stomach. Okay? The sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden forever. He's just saying it's all going to come out into the light. So in conclusion, Paul says this. When it comes to leaders in the church is not a place where just because it's spiritual that leaders can get away with manipulation or unkindness. You just got to pay attention. If there's substantiated claims, somebody's got to do an investigation. And how do you even deal with the money part? I'll just tell you practically how we put this into practice. I love that there's a church council. So it's a group of individuals who are not employed by the church, and they work out everybody's salaries. I have nothing to do with it, no say. And we just try to do it with data and impartiality. And what we have is we have like salary surveys that we have, and we have the closest job that we can find in the community. For instance, a youth pastor, a teacher salary. And so we put together salary surveys, we put together all the resources, and then we create a pay range. And it's not like, well, we like this. It's just data driven, and we try to be really equitable and fair. We try to be generous and conservative at the same time. And so I think that's about the best we can do. And when there's an accusation, man, leaders are not immune from failure. We just see it happen too much. We deal with it. Don't cover it up. Bring it into the open so that God can heal and move us forward. All right, so just some really practical things. How to get along with people, how to help, and how to deal with leadership.